School Teachers Workshop. So, public service announcement, I'm not going to be here for the next 2 Wednesdays. I'll be in Ecuador, but those 2 lessons have already in a sense been pre-recorded, so if you're a teacher and you're tapping into this, then you should have received the links at this point to all the installments for the Sunday School Teachers Quarterly Intensive, where I've went over that material already. Should be able to find it, hopefully relatively easy, but you'll have to search through those. They're not formulated, or I should say formatted, for the sake of tabbing out each video for where every lesson begins. But anyway, so this week we're moving over to Matthew chapter 5. And with that, we'll be discussing a little bit of the Sermon on the Mount. We've got 2 consecutive weeks with that, and then we move on. So if you're a teacher and you're familiar to an extent with the content of the Sermon on the Mount, knowing it spans Matthew 5 through 7 in its entirety, feel free to branch out and get a little bit deeper with respect to what the material itself is and how it interrelates with itself and, of course, with the larger context of Matthew, knowing that next week will be the last and final week we have with it, and that's only in Matthew 6. I don't think we have a single week of focus on the material in Matthew chapter 7. All right, so a tentative title I would be using for this lesson would be Flourishing in the Suffering. Hopefully that'll make sense as we go along through this. So the things that we need to make sure that we're picking up on as goes the nuts and bolts of the context of Matthew's gospel so far, and of course how this leads us into Matthew chapter 5, and some nuts and bolts of Matthew 5 through 7 a little bit separately. It's important for us to understand, connecting some of these dots together, that while there are some major overarching themes with respect to Matthew's gospel, again, he is the fulfillment, or I should say, Matthew is trying to help us understand how he wants us to see Jesus as the fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14. He is the Emmanuel, God incarnated in human flesh, which, if we're thinking through that, actually provides something of a bit of a new spin and a much deeper well with respect to the concept of fulfilling what Isaiah was talking about, and helps the enigma come to fruition and make it make sense, as goes the idea of how that phrase or title, Emmanuel, could really become a truth housed in a person. But as we march through the rest of that gospel, he wants us to see and appreciate how he is descended directly from Abraham through David. Jesus is in every way the fulfillment of who the Messiah is supposed to be, with the right pedigree and so forth. And of course, he is picking up with a broken history of Israel's horrible legacy and not fulfilling any of their mandate with respect to what they were supposed to do, walking faithfully with God. And as the fulfillment of Isaiah's servant in the later parts of Isaiah's scroll, is taking on that mandate and fulfilling it by redeeming it, taking that legacy and reworking it so that now it is seen through him as the faithful Israelite, or even better yet, a faithful Israel, and of course, allowing Israel to now enter into that period of time where they can be the faithful witness that God is choosing to use, having come through their exile, through the captivity in Babylon, to now this new future era where they are going to lead the nations in following this Messiah figure. That's a big overarching theme. Some smaller sub-themes, though, that still unite the total of Matthew's gospel but shouldn't be seen quite so predominantly, is the idea that Jesus is a greater Moses figure. We understand that by appreciating the fact that Matthew's gospel is broken down into 5 separate discourses, which is meant to mimic the structure of the Torah, which of course consists of 5 separate books written by Moses. And perhaps the Sermon on the Mount is the strongest of those links, because very quickly after we see the passage that we will focus on Sunday concluded, Jesus will go on this little monologue talking about how he was not sent to abolish the law, and not even the slightest stroke of a pen with respect to any of the Hebrew lettering will pass away until all of it is fulfilled. That is a whole separate lesson in and of itself. The point being is that Jesus is actually going to be ratcheting up the level of stringency with respect to the observance of these particular laws that he, after he makes that statement, is going to draw out with respect to adultery, murder, and various other things. So, as we see Jesus as a greater Moses, who is going to be the actual not just deliverer, but even lawgiver of the final Exodus movement that is now starting since he has jumped in on the scene. At the end of Matthew 4, he has completed his trials as the faithful servant, the new Israel. He has even called 12 disciples at this point. And granted, it's just the first couple of those disciples, but the idea is he's rebranding and remolding Israel, seen in the vein of those 12 apostles that are going to come out from the corpus of his larger disciples. And with this new Israel, he is launching the beginning of the kingdom. And this is going to become his kingdom manifesto. So now getting into the nuts and bolts of Matthew 5 through 7. A lot of times we will take these verses, we'll plaster them on desktop calendars or various other things, because in some ways they're encouraging. However, I would want us as teachers to perhaps refocus and reformat even our way of understanding how these verses perhaps would have been taken by these first hearers. Because when you stop to really slow down the script and appreciate what Jesus is saying in light of the larger biblical meta-narrative and the larger biblical contexts, these postures of heart that he is advertising here is not actually, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was jumping off the screen. Somebody moved my desk. These postures of heart that he's actually advertising aren't something that many of them perhaps would have necessarily seen as a desirable position to want to be in. Case in point, let's just go to some of the first ones, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Now, without even talking about the meaning of the word blessed and whether that connotes the idea of happy, either way, it's irrelevant for what we're talking about now. Instead, what we should focus on is what the phrase poor in spirit actually means. Now again, as opposed to just seeing this as something that we should all be striving for, which is not really the way that Jesus is picturing the Beatitudes as something to be taken. What he is, I think, trying to help us formulate here is the idea that his kingdom is defying all expectations. And his kingdom is not meant to be something seen as easy to enter into. It is easy to enter into, but the idea of grasping the concept of that kingdom and even the process of entering into it is completely contrary to anything anybody would have thought with respect to the kingdom. He's not simply a Messiah figure who is coming to help reconquer and reclaim a swath of land for these people to be resettled in and draw the diaspora or the dispersed Jews all over the various places where they live back into this kingdom that is going to slowly but surely become the wealthiest and most magnificent, glorious kingdom the world has ever known. Jesus is now broadcasting a kingdom in which everybody's character is going to have to be upended. And the way that people think about this kingdom and the way they think they interact with other people in this kingdom is a paradigm that's going to be completely flipped on its head. So following that concept, blessed are the poor in spirit, what I have in these green boxes for you are several other passages, some from the Old Testament and some from within the Sermon on the Mount itself or various other places where we can perhaps capture a snapshot of what these first century Jews would have thought about these postures of heart and how they would have seen or heard Jesus' statement to the effect of, your happiness will be found when you embrace this posture of heart, that they would have thought that is a bit more scandalous than something actually acceptable. Go to the 16th proverb where the writer says, better to be lowly of spirit, which is the same phrase, which is exactly what Jesus is connoting here with the idea of being poor in spirit. So we could sub that phrase in almost in reading the 16th proverb, better to be poor of spirit with the humble than to divide plunder with the proud. On its surface, that definitely seems something worthwhile, but the idea here is that there are two complete dichotomies here. And they're about as far apart as they can possibly be. The humble here are those who are basically beggarly. They have hardly no sustainable wealth whatsoever, if little more than the clothes on their back and maybe a spot to sleep in regularly at night. That's the idea. Versus, of course, those who are extremely wealthy. But the idea is also attached with the concept of those who are beggarly or humble, is that perhaps they would also be lowly of spirit, whereas those who are rich and wealthy would be haughty, high-minded, or proud. If there's just two choices in God's eyes, which is the better way to go? It's not to be wealthy and proud because he despises pride. On the other hand, it would be to be beggarly and in the process of that to also be poor of spirit. Okay? So the way that perhaps the first century Jew would have captured that is that I don't really want to be poor of spirit, because that would mean I'm low, and I don't want to be low, as goes social status. I'm tired of scratching a living off of land that I have to lease out a portion of every year with respect to my crops or anything else to Romans and the Herodian dynasty and whoever else is exacting taxes on me. And I'm praying for Messiah to come to oust these two particular ruling powers and give us back our kingdom so that we can flourish the way we did in the days of Solomon, where everybody sat under their own olive tree, everyone had their own donkey, and everyone, of course, had enough silver and gold that the kingdom really didn't keep tabs on how much silver there was. So another place to see this would be maybe the 143rd Psalm, where the writer says, "My spirit is weak within me." Again, moving between Hebrew and Greek, it's the same phrase. So we could almost sub in there, "My spirit is poor within me. My heart is overcome with dismay." So in reading that verse, does that sound like a position anybody in here would want to be in? Of course not. So hearing Jesus say, "Your happiness will be found in," or "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit," would perhaps come as something of a shock to anyone who would have heard that. Because what it seems to suggest is if you want to become a part of this kingdom, that's going to require a measure of sacrifice and suffering on your part. The next one would be, "Blessed are those who mourn." Mourning is certainly not a posture anyone would want to find themselves in, as demonstrated in the 69th Psalm, where the writer says, "Because zeal for your house has consumed me, I mourned and fasted." The writer here is David, and David is eaten up with this zeal, not only because he's happy to be in the Lord's house, but he understands that people do not share the same measure of religious fervor that he does. He recognizes not only his own sins, but the sins of his people, and the fact that many of them are a little bit too comfortable with the comforts of this world and are not quite living up to the measure of satisfaction that they should be finding in Yahweh if He was their chief pursuits over everything else. That's what's embodied in the rest of that psalm. David goes on to talk about how he, in this state of piety of heart, wants to express that through properly mourning and fasting over his own sins and the sins of others. But how is that treated? But it brought me insults. So mourning even over something such as sin with respect to grievous spiritual consequences would require a pouring out of heart and soul, but also an outward vestige that goes with that most people wouldn't find very appealing, because most cases where a person mourns and fasts, what kind of clothes do you find them wearing? Sackcloth, exactly. So everyone can see it. Then another verse perhaps that would show this would be Amos 5:16, and there are so many other examples to pull from. "The farmer will be called on to mourn, and professional mourners to wail." Now this is centuries before Jesus is walking the planet, but we know from one of Jesus' own stories, as goes the miracles he's performing, there's a moment where a 12-year-old girl on the brink of death dies in Jesus' procession to get to her house to heal her, and by the time he shows up, there's a crowd of people who are already singing dirges and playing flutes. These are the professional mourners, those who are called in to the scene for such a thing. Now, I could be wrong. None of us in here were ever alive at this particular time period. There's not a lot of literature to really purview with respect to how people thought about these crowds that were hired as professional mourners. But I can't imagine many people would like to hang out with them in public very much, because this is what they do. And anytime they're around, it's always a moment of deep sadness, because someone has just passed away. So to connote the idea of there's blessing attached to mourning is about as paradoxical as one can get, because mourning is only ever seen in the moments where there is deep, gut-wrenching sorrow, either for something spiritual and or physical that has happened with respect to a person dying. Moving on a little more. "Blessed are the humble." Now, it's easier to take this on the surface and think, well, this is a good thing. And I'm not saying it's not a good thing. I don't want you to think what I'm saying here is that Jesus is giving us something bad, or I just want to make sure I'm not confusing anyone. But blessed are the humble, of course, is a wonderful thing if we're taking it in a vacuum outside of this context and what Jesus is seeming to paint the picture of as we're building this measure of consistency from one blessing or beatitude to the next. Again, Humility is not something that really would have been embraced very much by the ancient world, even Jews for that matter. Now, the verse I give you here is a slightly different one, but if you look northward to that very first citation from the 16th proverb, I chose not to cite that one again because we've already seen that. Point being is that humility, or poorness of spirit, or in this case, lowness of spirit, seems to be very intimately attached to the idea of being humble. We think of humility as a person who really isn't someone who stands out in a crowd. They're not someone who speaks in a braggadocious manner. They're very easy to approach because they don't give off this intimidating vibe. That's not the way humility was seen in Jesus' day. Humility is the byproduct of humiliation. That's why I chose to cite here from Luke 13, where we have a moment where Jesus is being caught up on some current affairs, and someone is coming to tell him about this dastardly deed that Pilate did when he had two worshipers had their throats slit, apparently, and their blood mixed with their sacrifices when they came to offer in the temple. Now, that's about as humiliating as one can get, because not only are they being murdered or executed in that moment, but their final offering to their God is being defiled by their own blood being mixed with it, because Pilate knows very clearly that human sacrifice is something that is of absolute profanity to the Jews, and they would never do something like that. So he is insulting them perhaps in the highest possible way that he can, and this would obviously speak to the idea of being humiliated. That is what Jesus is capturing, though. It seems that that's what he's referring to if we're talking to Jews from a Jew who all of them know the Scriptures very well. The idea is that blessed are you when you have been humiliated. And that is not something anybody would ever want to willingly allow to have happen to them in this context. Moving to the next one. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. When we talk about this, usually in sermons or whatnot, we see this being given to us in the vein of this is something we're supposed to achieve or strive for. And that is a major takeaway, but we need to understand it in its original grounding before we get to that point. Because hungering and thirsting in the Old Testament context, again, is not something that anybody would want to find themselves doing. The 107th Psalm, they were hungry and thirsty. The psalmist is speaking openly about how the children of Israel, wandering out in the wilderness, were at times intensely hungry and deeply thirsty because God was testing them. And of course, their spirits fell within them. It leads them to grumbling and whatnot. Point being is that if a person is destitute or deprived of food and or water, it's a point of desperation that they would want to try to avoid because that means death is not too far away. Go back to the story of Hagar and Ishmael. The second time that Abraham forces them out of the house or the tent off into the wilderness, there is a point where Hagar has run out of everything and she can't stomach the idea of Ishmael doing what in front of her? Dying. And it's centered around the idea of loss of or lack of water. So it's the concept of if a person has need of these things, they're not in a good place. The same thing here with Matthew 23, although a completely different context. But in Matthew 23, Jesus is talking about the Pharisees. Now, the reason why I want to point this out is because a lot of times when we think of the Pharisees in the context of the narrative portions of the Gospels, we look at the Pharisees like they're a bunch of clowns. Problem with that is usually a vast measure of ignorance on our part as Bible teachers and or preachers with respect to who these people actually were. Because in Jesus' day, these people had reserved quite a bit of religious clout, and they had earned that. About a century and a half before Jesus is walking the earth, these people were the ones during the time of the Seleucid dynasty, when Antiochus Epiphanes, that king who decided he was going to lay siege to Jerusalem, shut the temple up, virtually outlaw any expression of Judaism, whether it was circumcising a son 8 days after birth, or even reading portions or being found with portions of any part of what we call the Old Testament. These Pharisees were willing to put themselves on the line, their money where their mouth was, and surrender to martyrdom. They would not miss a beat with respect to their religious and Jewish faith. So that being said, that dealt a fair measure of clout and credit to them by the time when Jesus is walking the earth. These people are the heroes of the day, whereas the Sadducees are those who are the Roman sympathizers and all too willing to go along to get along. The Pharisees not so much wanting to step out in the vein of the zealots and kill Romans, but they realize that Messiah will not come until we as a people are completely purified of mind or in mind and of heart, such that Messiah would be pleased to come and hand us the keys to this kingdom. And everyone was attempting to strive to try to listen to and abide by the teaching of the Pharisees the best they could, which Jesus deals quite the blow to them several verses later when he says in chapter 5, verse 20, that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you have no chance of entering into the kingdom of heaven. So back to Matthew 23, as Jesus is giving this long discourse of his estimation of the Pharisees, while on the one hand he's willing to credit them with respect to teaching what Moses says and trying to stay faithful to that, he also lambasts them for the fact that they load people up with all of these spiritual burdens that no one could possibly in any way, shape, or form abide by. You might ask, well, what does this have to do with hungering and thirsting for righteousness? Because in speaking to the idea of hungering and thirsting for righteousness to any of these Jews before he qualifies that in verse 20 by saying, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, they are thinking of Pharisees as the epitome, the model, the icon to strive for when it comes to expressing my righteousness. If I'm going to be righteous before God, I need to attain to what these teachers, these rabbis are telling me to do, or I don't stand much of a chance. So to commend a blessing to them would, in a sense, on the one hand say, do as the Pharisees do. Listen to what they are saying. But then he shocks them all the more in verse 20 to say, that isn't enough. You have to exceed that. And in their minds, that would be virtually impossible. So it's important to really capture the meaning behind what Jesus is saying in all of this, because Jesus is not telling them to chase after the Pharisees. He is going to define very shortly what exactly this righteousness looks like, and he's painting a picture such that they will all have to conclude, I cannot do this of myself. I need something supernaturally transformational to help me. And notice how Jesus seems to build on this, because when he says, blessed are the merciful in the very next verse, how is mercy taken by Jesus' own disciples? In Matthew 18, it's Simon Peter who asks the question, Lord, how many times am I supposed to forgive my brother? And he assumes himself very generous to say, do I forgive my brother as many as 7 times? But what does Jesus say? No, 70 times 7. Do you think Peter would have listened to that and then just shook his head? Ah, I see. Man, that makes so much more sense. It seems that if Peter was feeling himself mighty and generous and the idea of saying up to 7 times, but Jesus exponentially multiplies that by 70-fold, this is unheard of. No one in that day and time as a Jew thinks of mercy in that particular vein, where they are supposed to just hand it out, hand over foot to anyone for the slightest of infractions. After all, they have the sanction by the law, the allowance that they can hate their enemy. Now, granted, this is not really what Moses tells them. He tells them to love their neighbor as themselves. This was something that was added in over the centuries that passed with respect to the sages and the rabbis that have come before them, such that it's an acceptable allowance in Jesus' day, and he quotes a portion of the law that they know very well with respect to loving neighbor but hating enemy. And it becomes an acceptable decorum for them, if a person's been slighted, for them to hate someone who has done something to them so offensive. Hence, when Jesus also in Matthew 18, just a few verses later to illustrate this to Peter, uses a parable of something that's unthinkable. A king who is given an allowance of 10,000 talents. This is a value of money estimated within the millions within our own day and time. That a king would have given a servant an allowance or a loan that cumulatively balances out to 10,000 talents is almost ridiculous to think that would have ever happened. But the idea that a king, once that servant begged for forgiveness, would have just willy-nilly wiped the slate clean and forgave a debt that could have crippled his kingdom to allow that money to go unpaid is unthinkable. Not almost, it is completely unthinkable. So Jesus uses that as a way of posturing and illustrating to Peter the thing that Peter's already thinking. The idea of me forgiving someone for something 70 times 7 is completely unthinkable. So merciful, or being merciful in this way of Jesus talking, is something that these people really aren't thinking about, nor do they seem to have much of a context for it, outside of the way that God forgives them. Or when Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart." And a few verses after this, Jesus is going to say, "If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2." Notice he does not specify here who exactly would do this, but this is a known practice within the Roman world. So the Roman soldiers would have been doing this. Presumably, there probably would have been Romans either dressed in Roman garb or disguised that day in the audience of the thousands that were listening to Jesus. And instead of just pointing right to them and saying them, he just leaves it open-ended. If anyone, and thankfully that allowance is there because it doesn't have to be a Roman, although the Romans are the only ones who have the authority under pain of death for the person who wants to rebel to say, you have to carry my stuff for a full Roman mile. But for Jesus to say, go with him too, what's the idea? That you carry their stuff for an additional mile begrudgingly, or you willingly offer your services to extend this burden for an additional mile with happiness in step. No one would willingly do this. This is ridiculous. Or in the very next verse when Jesus says, give to the one who asks you and don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. This is straight from Moses with respect to the idea of the lending practices that Jews were to exercise and to always be open-hearted, never stingy or tight-fisted. Don't calculate how many years you have until the next year of Jubilee so you can calculate how much money you'll lose in the process. And you know this is the bare minimum I have to give to get this person by so I don't lose any more. You give them everything that they need. We have no record of anybody practicing such benevolence in the Old Testament. Not to say it didn't happen, but Jesus is just reiterating the idea of open-ended generosity, whether it's helping a fellow Jew or even a dogged Roman soldier that they all loathe and despise. Everyone is to be seen as equals. Again, scandalous to the nth degree. Or, blessed are the peacemakers. Jesus will say a few verses later on. I tell you, do not resist an evildoer. Now that's a whole separate conversation in and of itself as to what exactly Jesus means by this phrase evildoer. We don't have time to go into that. You can feel free to use your imagination to an extent. But the idea is that many of these people, based off the teaching of the Pharisees, would think it very well to resist an evildoer because if a person is doing evil within our midst, we have to expel them. The crux behind Pharisaism is whatever was good for the priestly class is good for us all. Hence all the various practices with respect to eating, washing of hands and dishes, because if these things were expected of the priests, who were the purest of us all before God, and holiest of all of us before God, then there really is no way for all of us to be seen as holy and pure unless we all take those practices and embed them in our daily routines. And if they cannot allow evil in the sacred places, we have no right to allow evil within our own midst, as goes our homes and our towns. So get rid of them all. Charge them in the courts. Have these people strung up. Have them executed, whatever the case might be. Jesus says don't resist them, even if they're coming after you. On the contrary, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Ridiculous. Or Matthew 5:24. The idea of leaving your gift in front of the altar, it would seem to suggest you have but one final step or two to take before you give this precious gift that you have brought to God as an expression of repentance and or thanksgiving. But before you complete that, if there is some measure of struggle or tension between you and another human being, you are to go first rectify that before you bring your offering to God. Now, in the mind of the first century Jew, who do you think relationally is more important to them? God or other human beings? It's not that Jesus is trying to invert that way of thinking so much as the idea of God does not want your sacrifice if you have hatred or aught toward a fellow human being who bears the image of God and dare think you could come before the God whose image they bear and have good relationship with him and that he's going to be okay with this. That's the idea. He wants to invert that paradigm with respect to their way of thinking. All of this to say, by the end of it all, I'm sure many of them were probably a little aghast and thinking to themselves, how do we do this? And then Jesus caps it all off by saying, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. Because you have to know, if you start thinking and then thereby acting this way, people are going to see you in a very peculiar, albeit new and transformed light. And if you read the works of people like Larry Hurtado, when he wrote a book, I think it was called Destruction of the Gods. Name escapes me. It's very similar to that, but easy enough to Google. Larry Hurtado. And his whole book is just talking about how Christianity systematically conquered the world, at least the known world, ruled by the Romans, in the first 3 centuries after its inception. Because of these particular things, the manner of being that the Christians embodied, and the way that other people who were not part of their circles spoke about them. Some of them spread some extremely heinous and nasty and albeit untrue rumors about them with respect to things like incest and cannibalism, but many others who are willing to be more open and in alignment with the truth, despite what they thought of their religion, were all too willing to accept the fact and even report the fact that Christians were hand over fist, benevolent and generous people. And the only way that could have come about would have been that heart transformation that starts here with these very easy, packageable sayings, such as, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure in heart. But if we take it back to the original context of what Jesus is saying here and where he said it and to whom he said it, it perhaps would have had a different face value and shock value in the immediate moment. Okay. Any thoughts or questions before we conclude? Anything? All right. Well, as always,